So welcome everyone, and there is a huge crowd here. I'm not intimidated at all. There are some familiar faces, and I'm really happy to see so many people that I have had the privilege to speak to before. As was stated in the introduction, I am a technical writer. I've been vegan for 14 years, 15 years, and yeah, I have been in vegan activism for probably the past 5 or 6 years. So I'm really excited for being part of this Congress today, and excited to give a presentation about radical veganism. If I am speaking too fast, or because of course I get super nervous and I will start to dash through this presentation. So if I'm speaking too fast, just raise your hand or get my attention, cluck like a chicken, I don't know, whatever. It's totally fine, and just just signal for me to slow down a little bit. The reason why I wanted to put this presentation together is because through my own journey into veganism, and specifically vegan activism, I had noticed that there are a lot of things that many of us don't take into account in order to understand or engage with veganism in the 21st century. Because so many things have shifted in our understanding of veganism and in animal rights. And we should take these things into consideration. So I did a presentation obviously called Radical Veganism, Animal Liberation for the 21st Century, which we're like 2 decades into now. So yeah, like the reason why I wanted to talk about radical veganism is very specific. Our understanding of radical things it's in the global West. Oh gosh, my hair and the microphone are not cooperative sometimes. Our understanding of things that are radical in the global West are sometimes misunderstood, especially in the United States where I am from. And like a lot of people are intimidated by the phrase radical or radical veganism. And when I've engaged with a lot of people who work with very high-profile organizations, some people have cautioned me against talking about a radical ideology. And it's like, oh, use any word but that. That's a very scary word for a lot of people. But I think that we need to reclaim being radical, because being radical means returning to the root for a lot of us. I actually included some quotes that are from some of my favorite people talking about being radical. This is Angela Davis, who is a civil rights icon and a prison abolitionist and longtime vegan herself. And she's also the person who's gracing my shirt today. She's one of my favorite people. Yeah, like this quote, I don't know if everyone can read it in the back, and of course I will read all of the captions that are here also. The process of trying to assimilate into an existing category in many ways runs counter to efforts to produce radical or revolutionary results. Meaning that we can't just do the same things or do the conventional things that have given us the culture that we live in. We need to do things that are radical. We need to embrace radical and revolutionary approaches to liberation. We have to act, this is her second quote, we have to act as if it is possible to radically transform the world, and we have to do it every day. That is such a powerful quote. It is something that I have to remind myself of every day, all the time. This is something that I never want to forget. Dr. Martin Luther King also, when you are right, you cannot be too radical. And when you're wrong, you cannot be too conservative. People oftentimes think that this is radical, this is extreme, especially when we're talking about veganism, especially when we're talking about animal liberation. Just the concept itself is very intimidating for a lot of people. Just the idea that animals should be left to live their best lives is just like, that's radical for so many people. And it shouldn't be. Like, this should really be easy. In fact, a lot of the things that I talk about in this presentation today are probably going to be confronting for some of us. But these should not be radical ideas. And there's also another quote from George Monbiot, who is in the UK. He actually appeared on the Frankie Boyle show a couple of weeks ago, and this was a quote that he had given us. It says, "It is irresponsible right now to be a centrist or a moderate." He was actually talking about in our actions toward climate change right now. We are living in a time that it is an absolute climate emergency for us to take action. Also during this program, he was talking about individual things that we can do to actually have an impact on climate change. And one of the things that he said was adopt a plant-based diet and cut way, way down on our flying. Of course, I'm breaking one of those rules by coming here, but insofar as I am able to, I take the train to as many places as possible, which is more time consuming, yes, but it's an absolute necessity. when we're talking about like our lives and our future on this planet that we share with so many other species. He says the realistic position right now is to be radical. We need to move in a very short period of time. People think that like, oh, well, the way that we need to shift is very incremental, it's very slow, and incremental change is actually what's partially what has gotten us into the situation that we're in right now. We literally do not have time for incremental change. If you're familiar with Greta Thunberg, who's been like, doing her world tour right now, she tells us, I don't want you to be hopeful, I want you to panic. Act as if the house is on fire, because it friggin' is. Like, this is important. We need to act in a radical way, but we treat being radical as something to be feared rather than something to be embraced. And so people often, like, they ask, what does it mean to embrace radical veganism? There are 8 principles of radical veganism, the way that I interpret it. The first one and most important one is animals are persons of a marginalized community. That, again, doesn't seem like it should be confronting, but you would be surprised how many people I speak to who don't embrace animals as persons. And these are people who are part of the animal rights community. These are people who are vegan, people who believe in, quote, animal rights, but don't really treat animals as though they are part of a marginalized community, who don't view veganism as a movement for animal liberation or for social justice. And that's a problem. Every scientific authority would agree that there are no characteristics that are universally absent in other species or universally present in the human species that would actually confer personhood. And again, this should not be controversial. We look at, this is actually a headline from the newspaper The Independent in the UK. Spanish Town Council votes overwhelmingly in favor of defining pets as non-human residents. This article was actually from 2015. And so, it's not a very, it's not, this isn't something that happened just in the past 5 minutes. We've been conferring rights to other species as persons for years. And in individual landmark court cases, we have granted individual personhood to animals. And this is just an example that Spain has granted personhood to other species. So we recognize that animals are persons under very specific circumstances, but those are limited circumstances instead of recognizing animals as persons universally. When they have culture, when they build societies, when they communicate with one another and have complex emotional relationships with one another, this should not be this should not be a radical thing, and yet it somehow is. I get confronted by people who don't think of animals as persons and really treat me in a very hostile way, because to them, this is not something that, and that's speciesism. That is a hallmark of speciesism, to not recognize that the persons whom we are representing or whom we seek to represent are themselves part of a marginalized community. And this is an important thing for us to internalize also, because we need to seek solidarity with other persons who are part of marginalized communities. And I say that as I stand here before you as a queer Black person from the United States. And again, there are organizations who are working on the personhood of non-human animals all the time. The Non-Human Rights Project is led by Stephen Wise. He is an attorney in the United States who has been working on this for years. My first introduction to Stephen Wise was through his book called Though the Heavens May Fall. Wise had written this book which had described the landmark case that happened in the UK in Great Britain that ended slavery, or signified the end of slavery. That was a misspeak on my part. It didn't end slavery, but there was a specific judgment that had been handed down, and in the judgment, the phrase was used because people were talking about slavery and ending slavery as though this was going to completely wreck society, and the sky was going to fall, and just cats and dogs would be living together. Up would become down, Black would become white, and just there would be sheer pandemonium in the streets. And of course, in this landmark decision, he used the phrase, and let justice be done. Though the heavens may fall, let justice be done. And using that, that ideology, using this understanding of personhood, he has built the Non-Human Rights Project into something that is an extraordinary organization. This is number 2. Radical veganism elevates the perspectives of marginalized persons because we are natural architects of liberation movements. And again, like, it would be surprising to a lot of people. Like, when I look at the people who are perceived as leaders in the animal rights movement, most of them are persons who are of European heritage, who are upper or upper middle class, who have a lot of the advantages in life, and we look at these people as though they are the leaders. And this shouldn't take anything away from the important work that they do, but it's a backwards approach to liberation, so far as I have observed it historically. Like, the natural architects of any liberation movement are the people who have lived with systemic disenfranchisement and systemic like oppression ourselves. And so, yeah, like, seeking people who, like, who have the most advantages in our society and, like, elevating those people to leadership positions rather than, like, elevating the voices of people who are from marginalized communities is in some ways a very backwards approach. Maybe you know these individuals and maybe you don't. We'll actually discuss them a little bit more in the second presentation on digital media for animal rights. What you're looking at on the left is Logan Paul. He's a YouTube celebrity. Take that for what you will. And, like, on the right, that is, her name was formerly Vegan Kalel. She is also a YouTube celebrity. And neither one of these people are vegan right now. They were vegan for all of like 5 minutes, and, like, they had amassed these huge followings. And yeah, I see, like, some of you are, like, laughing because you're familiar with these situations, which were absolutely catastrophic. Logan Paul was popular for doing, like, very insensitive and in some cases overtly racist stunts in order to build his YouTube following to become one of the most popular persons on YouTube. And, like, and when he had, like, this was a person who actually had tased dead rats and had been criticized by PETA for it. And then one day he announced that he was going to go vegan. All of a sudden, everything was completely forgiven. And, like, we just had this insurmountable wealth of forgiveness for, like, certain persons in our society. And, like, and especially, like, if they announce that they're going vegan, and we just all universally embraced him. Just a couple of short months later, like, oh, BTW, I'm not vegan anymore, and also I'm going to record videos of me, like, being incredibly insensitive to vegans. And not very much different with Kalel over here as well. So, like, but again, these are the people that we raise up to leadership positions. These are the people that we look to as, quote, heroes so often. Like, again, like, people who are European presenting, young, attractive, able-bodied, like, beautiful, like, all of these attributes that, like, that we value in individuals, and, like, and again, wealth, like, but that runs counter to everything that we understand, not just about social movements, but also psychology. It's natural for, like, people who are disadvantaged by society to actually, again, have greater empathy. And that's been demonstrated. This is actually this is an article from Scientific American. It's from 2012, but I have read multiple studies on this, that, like, the higher you are in the social hierarchy, the shorter your social gaze is. And, like, this has been demonstrated over and over again. And so, like, but, like, the lower you are in the social hierarchy, the more empathy you actually have. And so, again, why do we elevate other people to leadership positions who have so many advantages? And, like, we don't really recognize the value that people from diverse backgrounds bring, from disadvantaged backgrounds bring. Again, I'm sorry for stumbling over my words. I do get nervous when I am speaking in front of large crowds. And these are some of the people, like, you might recognize the person who's in the center. Trudy is in the room with us and is going to be doing a presentation a little bit later on. These are persons from marginalized backgrounds that don't have quite so much representation in the animal rights movement. On the far right over here, you see Unique Vance, who runs Vegan Voices of Color in the United States. This is Ariana Birdie on the far left. She runs Encompass Movement, which actually seeks to help diversify the animal rights movement and the animal protection movement through diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And again, like, you've got Trudy here, who, like, runs Crick Hume Animal online and is part of so many projects, and, like, has spoken out about the connections between animal liberation and disability justice. Over here you've got, like, Jeff Mans. He actually is in Germany. Some of you may be familiar with him, but again, like, he is a queer person. He's also a social psychologist who focuses on, like, human sexuality and largely animal sexuality as well. An incredible body of work that is largely overlooked, and especially coming from a queer perspective. In the upper right corner, you see Patrice Jones. I saw a couple of Patrice's books on the back table, and Patrice has written endlessly about human rights and about animal rights. And of course, I'm very privileged to work with Patrice at Vine Sanctuary. It's a queer-run animal sanctuary in the northeastern part of the United States. Again, because she's published endlessly, you can read about so much of her work, and again, it gets overlooked. And on the bottom, you see Gerardo Tristan, who runs Fawn Acción. So again, like just the diversity of people and voices that we have in animal rights that so many of us are unfamiliar with and who don't enjoy quite so much representation, and probably should be, like, you know, more prominently displayed. And we'll talk more about why that is and the practical application of it a little bit later. What you're looking at right here, this is the Philadelphia Move organization, which was active from the late 1970s until around the mid-1980s in the United States. And the Philadelphia Move the Philadelphia Move organization is and it's still like active somewhat, but like the Philadelphia Move organization is a Black liberation group that also focused on Black liberation and animal liberation together. And they had a very unfortunate incident. It was actually, some people would characterize it as an act of domestic terrorism in 1985 on May 13th when the Move House was actually bombed by the city of Philadelphia. And 11 people, including at least 5 children, lost their lives because they were burned alive in this, and countless companion animals. This is a quote from Janine Africa. She is part of the Move organization. Just talking about the history of Move. We demonstrated against puppy mills, zoos, circuses, any form of enslavement of animals. We demonstrated against 3 Mile Island, the nuclear power plant, and industrial pollution. This was in the 1970s. These were not very popular things to be doing in the 1970s, especially for Black liberation groups during, like, you know, this time of Black empowerment and, like, you know, after the civil rights movement. Were some of the like major accomplishments of the civil rights movement. We demonstrated against police brutality, and we did so uncompromisingly. Slavery never ended, it was just disguised. So again, like, how many people in this room have actually heard of the Philadelphia Move organization? We got a handful of hands that have gone up. That's sad. This is a part of our history. This is a part of animal rights history. This is an overlooked, under-discussed part of our animal rights history. This is the erasure of very important parts of our history. And it's important, again, because these are people who lost their lives because they believed in what they had done. They believed in what they were doing so passionately. And they believed in it and were effective in protesting it to the degree that it scared the state. And the state had exercised an act of violence against them. And this is like, you know, this is what we're dealing with. This erasure is part of what we need to correct. And part of correcting that is to behave in a radical way. This is another quote from a piece written by The Guardian by Ed Pilkington just last year. That's an image of John Africa. Again, like, all of the people who were part of the Philadelphia Move organization had adopted the last name of Africa. And most of them had followed a vegan diet, of course. Then there were the dogs. When the 1978 siege happened, there were 12 adults and 11 children in the Move House in Powelton Village. This was before the bombing in 1985, but there was a siege in 1978. And 48 dogs. 48 dogs. Most of the animals were strays taken in by the group as part of its philosophy of caring for the vulnerable. Black liberation, animal liberation, the two are as one with Move. John Africa was known as the dog man, as he was rarely seen without one. In a much longer presentation on digital media for animal rights, I actually go further into the history of the Move organization and some of the ways that they were represented in the media, because the media was absolutely complicit in the 1980s with the police in vilifying this organization to the degree that, like, everyone in the Philadelphia area, and of course nationally as well, looked at them as people that were dangerous, that were criminal, and that were deserving of, realistically speaking, being burned alive. We don't have time for that right now, so we won't go into that history. But again, like, you know, this is just a part of animal rights history that largely, like, we don't know about internationally or even in the United States. We think that, like, you know, that like most of the popular activism has been done by people who look more like folks in the audience rather than people who look like myself. And that is a danger. That is a real danger because like when you engage in these erasures, when we don't see ourselves represented properly in the animal rights movement, then it doesn't really encourage us to be part of it. It reinforces the stereotypes that this is something, an elitist activity that white and middle class people engage in. And nothing could be further from the truth. Most of the time when I talk to people who look like myself, they think that black liberation exists in opposition to animal liberation, rather than embracing it as a natural extension of our own liberation, because our success, our freedom, it's combined. It doesn't exist in a vacuum, separately from one another. Radical veganism is not intersectionality. A lot of people would phrase me as an intersectional vegan. This is being recorded, so hopefully I can show this video to people so that they better understand once and for all, I don't personally identify as an intersectional vegan. It's okay if you do, but I should explain why I don't personally identify as an intersectional vegan myself. Intersectionality is a phrase that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. She is a legal scholar, and she is a sociologist. She's a remarkable, dynamic black woman. And none of what we discuss should take away from that. She's incredible. She had discussed intersectionality, or she had coined this phrase as a legal concept. Because she was arguing a case for a black woman who was experiencing discrimination in the workplace. And there was no way to express the discrimination that she was experiencing, because there was either sexism or there was racism, but there was no way to actually identify that this was a person who was a victim of both simultaneously. And so she talked about intersectionality by way of discussing, and unfortunately this failed, by the way, but she had coined intersectionality as a way of discussing the very unique violations of rights that black women experience in the workplace and beyond. And of course, you fast forward 30 years, and we kind of have we use intersectionality to discuss a broad range of intersections or commonalities between different types of oppression. And unfortunately, this doesn't work for me. Number one, although she has gone on record to say that she doesn't mind that intersectionality has been used to discuss animality, but Crenshaw herself is not vegan. And she doesn't speak openly about animal rights. And for me, that kind of disqualifies the use of intersectionality in my own activism. Again, this is not unique. This isn't specific to anyone else. Whatever you do, if you like it, I love it. That's great. But this is just for myself. But if she doesn't personally embrace this as part of the spectrum of oppressions that others experience, or ways in which oppression manifests, then it's very difficult for me to internalize it as well. Plus, perhaps more importantly, black women are still experiencing the same type of discrimination that they did 30 years ago. So how I can use this term to actually to broaden the range of discussion when black women are still experiencing the same outcomes that they did before. And realistically, for me, I feel like it is important to include intersectionality in our understanding of animal rights, but animals deserve to have a movement that focuses on them, and that's why I bring it back to radical veganism, rather than for myself appropriating a term that was originally meant for another group of marginalized persons themselves. So if you want to use that term, absolutely do, but this is a reason why, or these are reasons why I personally do not. Even though I strongly believe in intersectionality, and I think that including intersectionality in our understanding of animal rights is important. Next point, radical veganism does not focus on diet or health. Again, possibly pretty contentious. Why? Because eating animals is the way that most of us engage, or the most obvious way that we all engage with animals every day, multiple times a day. But I don't think that it's productive to necessarily focus on diet, because when we allow people to look at veganism as a diet, things tend to get very, very messy. People will actually take that and absolutely run with it and introduce all types of other types of derailments into the discussion, and we'll get into that a little bit later. This is actually a post by an administrator for the Disabled Vegan Support Group. When we're talking about health, health is very specific for a lot of people, and I will read the text out to you. It's actually on the next slide here. And this was a post that the Keisha Marie, the administrator, had written that was very personal to her, and it's a little bit long. Running this page is really hard sometimes. I get people saying pretty terrible things to me a lot, and I usually don't let it get to me. But for some reason, that's harder for me today. Trudy will definitely talk about the intersections of of ableism and veganism a little later on. But Keisha goes on to say, I'm doing everything I possibly can to be healthy, and I'm still extremely sick. Then I get people saying that my page is bad because I'm sick and vegans need to promote a healthy lifestyle. And I just want to disappear into my small bubble of people who love me. I'm not really looking for anything but to get this out there. I have been vegan for 6 years this June, and I am, according to trolls, bad for veganism by existing. It just hurts. I want to be bulletproof and confident enough that none of this bothers me like the activists I look up to, but I'm soft and timid and sensitive, and I don't know how to be any other way. And this is part of the reason why we don't focus on health when we talk about radical veganism. Health is such an important thing for every person. Yes, we should absolutely acknowledge that being vegan or living on a plant-based diet is perfectly healthy. It is a healthy thing to do for most people in all stages of life. And it's something that can be used as a tool to help us get past certain conditions. And of course we should recognize that the eating of animal products exacerbates other conditions. But outside of saying that, promoting veganism as a means to, quote, perfect health is so enormously damaging to so many people like Keisha and others. And so by focusing on health, we're actually doing a disservice to people who are a part of our community who don't experience health the same way that we do, or don't even have the capacity to experience health the way that we all do individually. So no, we don't focus on health, and we certainly don't focus on diet. Diet can be very, very triggering for a lot of people, especially people who live with eating disorders. And again, diet introduces a derailment into the conversation that doesn't necessarily have to be there. How many people have heard of a food desert? A lot more hands are going up. How many people have had food deserts introduced into a conversation where you're talking about veganism by way of invalidating veganism or animal rights? Yeah, I still see some hands that are going up. And this is, again, a danger because, this is probably going to be controversial to say, but, conflating veganism with food justice is, for me, not the approach that I want to take. Food justice is important, but, food justice and food access and availability of healthy food should not be confused with veganism because it's not a vegan-specific issue. People deserve access to healthy food regardless of what diet they follow. And again, veganism is not a diet. And so that is a danger when we allow people to hijack our conversations about animal and human liberation and make it about food access or food insecurity. That's a problem because everyone deserves access to healthy food. And again, health is relative for everyone. And so, yeah, when we allow people to hijack our discussions about liberation movements, we should work adjacent with food justice organizations. And there are a lot of great food justice organizations out there who are vegan. Brenda Sanders in the United States, I cannot list all of the projects that Brenda works on because there are so many, but she runs the Vegan Society. She runs Thrive Baltimore, Pep Foods, and all of these are vegan and they serve disadvantaged human communities in the United States. A Well-Fed World, run by Dawn Moncrief, is another food justice organization. There are so many there are so many food justice organizations that are vegan, but again, to conflate veganism with food justice is a dangerous thing because it allows people to absolutely run away with the conversation, and centering the conversation on animal liberation and human liberation is very, very important to me. Because once more, animals deserve to have they deserve to have a movement unto themselves. And this is a slide that actually is quoting an article from the Washington Post. Do food deserts matter? Do they even exist? And this is a misleading headline, by the way, because of course food deserts exist and of course they matter. But again, overstating food deserts or not even understanding what food deserts are and how they are different from food swamps is it's a fundamental misunderstanding that people use to invalidate veganism all the time, and I just don't want to allow that. Yes? Absolutely. For the folks who don't know what a food desert is, I should probably explain it. A food desert is a geographic area where people don't have access to healthy food in the United States. They're lower income people who are concentrated in a specific area, who don't have access to grocery stores or food or fresh markets or farmers markets where they can like readily access like healthy food. And again, this is also, I have to say, like a very like U.S. specific problem. Because when you venture outside of the United States, and I'm having conversations with other people in other areas about food deserts, people scrunch up their eyebrow and they're like, I don't have any idea what you're talking about. So and of course you wouldn't. And for me, this also manifests as a way, as an example of American imperialism. Because when you're having conversations, we're in the middle of like Europe right now, we're in the Netherlands. And like you're having conversations with people about about veganism and animal rights, and then they throw in the food desert card, and all of a sudden you can't talk about this anymore, and and you're frozen in fear because if I don't address the food desert problem as part of my veganism, then I'm probably then I'm probably classist or racist or just introduce all of these, and that's what I mean when I say this is a danger. In our activism, because we allow people to derail conversations about animal liberation by saying you're classist and you're ableist and you are racist because you don't include this in part of your discussion. And it's like, wow, I would never do that to someone else if they were actually talking about child labor and the way that my clothes are made. Oh, well, guess what? If you're not buying the most ethical clothes from American Apparel, in Southern California, and everyone's making a livable wage, then I think that you're classist and you're not including people in the discussion. I would never do that, but people feel free to do that to veganism all the time. And so, yeah, this is, thank you for asking me to explain that, and I hope it better explains it for other people. Just a quote from the article, at Albertsons, one of the Seattle area's cheaper supermarkets, shoppers tend to be lower income, a measure that's been correlated with adverse health outcomes. They have salads and they have apples. You can't go up them. This is Adam Drunowski from the University of Washington, quoting him now. They have salads and they have apples at this grocery store. You can't go at them saying that they only have French fries and salted foods. So now what? So yeah, what? Even when people are introduced to healthy foods, or when you introduce a healthy food market to an area that was lacking it, it's not a guarantee that people are going to eat healthy. So overstating, the level of access, which is important, but overstating that importance is dangerous, because it doesn't mean that people are automatically going to eat healthier food. People are going to say, he actually goes on to say in the second part of the quote, the hope is that they will be buying bags of fresh apples, but you can also see the same reaction of, oh, this is great, I can get my donuts much closer. That's the thing that, first of all, that happens to me. I'm I really am not, I'm totally here for the donuts and the French fries. I'm not going to the store and buying apples. This is not about eating healthy for me. I am vegan. I'm probably going to die very soon because I live on a diet of coffee and French fries and some sort of fried gluten. This is my life, and this is health for me. So that's what it means for me. So again, this is a huge danger. And it's a red flag. When people do this, they usually are not interested in actually having a conversation, a meaningful conversation. They're tokenizing groups of people, groups that are already disadvantaged, groups that don't have access, in order to avoid having a conversation about how they internalize speciesism more often than not. That's a regrettable truth, and again, it's not very popular to say, but this is a reality for us. Radical veganism is political. Again, a really, it seems like a no-brainer to me. Boy, I cannot tell you how many times I have conversations with people where they're saying, oh, keep politics out of veganism. What they really want to say is, keep your identity politics out of veganism, because they're looking at me and they're like, oh, here he comes with his black agenda again, or here he comes with his gay agenda again. And they would be right, because I definitely have those agendas. But I have an animal rights agenda also, and more importantly so. And these are vegans who are having this discussion with me. Vegans are really antagonistic to the fact that, that this is a political issue for me, and it should be a political issue for all of you. Yeah, what they are trying to say when they say keep your politics out of veganism is keep your black and gay politics out of veganism. Keep your sex politics out of veganism. Keep your identity politics out of veganism. Without ever recognizing, once again, that animals are persons. They have identities. They are marginalized persons with their own, with their own character. They're not looking at animals as individuals. You probably can't see this very well because it's a black and white image and it's very bright in the room. But this was an article in the New York Times that was from January, and the title of the article is "A Black Legacy Wrapped Up in Fur." There is a sense, and then the subheadline, there is a sense among many black women the cultural disavowal of fur has coincided with our increased ability to purchase it. Meaning that like, oh, fur has gone down in value with the ability of black women to have access to it. And like when you look at this, this is actually written by like, you can probably look this up yourselves like at any given time. So it doesn't matter whether I talk about the author or not. But yeah, this is an article written by an author named Jasmine Sanders. And I thought that it was a very curious article at the time that I read it in January, and I'm building up to something here, so just stay with me. I'm like, there was no reason to write this piece. There was nothing, like, there was no outcry at the time. But then we learned some things later on about, about why this article appeared in the New York Times. And let's not even address how difficult it actually is to get an article in the New York Times if you're not a seasoned journalist. And she didn't really have much of a high profile at the time that it was published. So a lot of red flags were going off for me as a person with a journalistic background. Fast forward to just last week. This is a demonstration out in front of the New York City Council that actually took place on May 8th. I cannot remember who these photos are courtesy of right now. And it's gonna come to me at like 3 o'clock this morning, and I'm going to send out a mass email to all of you. But this is like, the reason why this is relevant is because, as it turns out, fur lobbyists have actually been working on mobilizing black activists and black church groups in the city of New York for a while now. They were reaching out to these church groups, and they were trying to push the message that like the ban that's being voted on this coming Wednesday on the 15th about whether or not the city of New York should allow the sale of new fur going forward is racist. That's the message that's being pushed by the fur lobby. And that is a message that people have been actually accepting and promoting in my community in New York City. It makes me fucking mad to think that this is what the other side are doing. And so people like who are vegan say, oh, like keep your politics out of veganism. This isn't a political thing. Like, you want to you want to make this a black thing, or you want this to be about, no, guess what? This is what the other side is actually doing. These are the types of tactics that they engage in. If you orphan people of color, if you orphan queer people, if you orphan queer people of color in the animal rights movement, the other side is going to actively court them. And they're going to co-opt a message that is actually anti-black in and of itself. Because of what we all know is that European institutions have actually been the purveyors of fur for most of human history. They're the ones who benefit most from the production of fur, and they're the ones who most commonly buy it, even today, by sheer numbers. And so this is an actively anti-black agenda that fur lobbyists have actually been promoting, and they've been doing it for months now. And so when I say that we need to actually support the people of color in our movement who are actually doing this work, that outreach efforts to people who look like me are not in vain, and they're not wasted, this is meaningful, because if you don't, then these are the people who will win. And look at this. Like, again, I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see it, but that first image, the one is actually the demonstration itself on the steps of the government building. These are the people who are handing out the signs to these people that they used in the demonstration. Notice what these people look like, and notice what the demonstrators look like. Look at the signs. You can see, hopefully you can see the red arrows pointing to them. There's an absolute disparity in the people that they are using, that they are tokenizing in order to push their message, while they themselves actually get to sit in the background. And of course, what is the outcome that they hope will happen? If you can convince city council persons that something is racist, nobody wants to look racist. And it's easy for them. Why? Because we already have veganism and animal rights perceived as an elitist thing, a hobby of upper class, usually European-looking people. We already have that perception. This is an easy win for them. This should have been an easy win for us. Should still be an easy win for us because we haven't given up hope. We're still working on this. We're still fighting with this. But we need support. We need support from people who have all of the institutional power. We need support from people who have the financial interests, who have the financial power to actually mobilize our communities. And we can't be like disregarded or looked at as a liability or looked at as like, oh, like, this is like you're trying to make this a black thing. No, this is already political. The other side recognizes that. The dairy lobby absolutely recognizes that. The people who are pushing meat, they absolutely recognize that. They're the ones who are paying to get like government subsidies all the time. This is absolutely political. And the fact that I still have to fight this battle even now, it is sickening. And it's also exhausting. Talk about like, the ways that like the ways that we experience like intersecting oppressions. Like when you're black and gay and vegan, boy, you've got a long road to hoe. This is a lot of hard work because I've got to get buy-in from the people who are in this room, I've got to get buy-in from the black community, and I got to get buy-in from the queer black community. And folks out there that are like reinforcing sexist, racist, or homophobic rhetoric who are within the vegan community, they're making my job 10 times harder. This is the Coalition for Blacks for Fur. This is actually, yeah, like this, oh no, laugh, go ahead, because this is absurd. This is another tool of the fur industry, just to like, carry on with the same message. They've got a Facebook group. When you actually look at the Facebook group, this is absolutely hilarious, if not sickening. Look at the, like, you can't, again, because it's very bright in here and like, and the slides are difficult to see, but these are people who are actually part of the group. None of these people are black, I gotta tell you. None of these people are, and so this is laughable. Like, it's laughable, but it's also completely infuriating to me. Like, again, like, like, recognize the value that marginalized people bring to your community, like, bring to the animal rights community. Like, these people are actively engaging in digital blackface. I am furious. When I saw this, my blood pressure was at 10,000. I am furious. They are stealing and using and tokenizing my people. This is human exploitation, compounded by animal exploitation. How dare they? How fucking dare they? I am so angry about this. So yeah, like, this is definitely a political issue. Radical veganism embraces the broad spectrum of social, cultural, intellectual, and scientific advances we've made since the mid-20th century when European veganism was popularized. We're going to be wrapping up in a couple of minutes, so I'm sorry that, like, again, I'm speaking a lot. But yeah, like, a lot of us, like, it's important for us to go back to the root of veganism. It's important for us to recognize the value of veganism as it was defined by Donald Watson in 1944. Guess what's happened since 1944? A lot of shit. Like this book on the far right, that's Evolution's Rainbow. It's a book written by an actual biologist who is also a trans woman, Joan Roughgarden, that talks about the diversity of gender presentation throughout the animal kingdom. How fucking remarkable that we have access to this type of literature in the 21st century that teaches us about gender presentation and gender identity. And like, people say, oh, like this is a new thing, this like, this gender queer kind of like non-binary, gender non-conforming, these made-up words and like, and so people say, oh, this is like, this is like, no, this is scientifically like, wrong. They're biological essentialists, and this is the reality of animal biology. This is the reality of gender presentation in the animal kingdom. It's widespread. This is so common. Like we talk about sometimes, like homosexuality is practiced by like more than 1,500 species, or it's observed in more than 1,500 species, but homophobia only presents in the human species. But there's so much more to queerness than like, than being gay or same-sex attraction or same-sex relationships. And this book explores that. Franz de Waal wrote the book, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? We've had so many like intellectual advances about like, animal cognition and animal sentience and animal intelligence that we need to embrace as well about like, our understanding. A lot of us don't read these books. A lot of us don't engage in like literature outside of the vegan community. If it's not written by a vegan person, then like, then this is something that we shouldn't pay attention to, or it's not a part of like, our conversations. And we need to look outside of our community, look at people who are animal behaviorists, embrace solidarity with people who are part of the ecological or environmental justice communities, embrace like, the advances that we have learned, like, in the past 50, 60, 70 years. In all of the knowledge that we have to draw on, regardless of whether people are vegan or not. Animal Madness is a book that I actually use in the classroom. It's written by Laurel Braitman that actually talks about like, the ways that like zoochosis manifests in a lot of animals, particularly in zoos. And the broad range of psychological conditions that other species are susceptible to. Like if some of us, if we're fortunate enough to have companion animals at home, separation anxiety in dogs, like depression, when like a human or other animal companion dies in the family, like, you know, and so many psychological conditions that are, again, not unique to humans. We need to learn about these types of things and embrace all of these like advances that we have, that we're very fortunate enough to have in our community. Again, very important. People are probably going to like stab me after this presentation, because like this is something that like I have to have a discussion about. Animal liberation will not be achieved through green capitalism. What in the world am I talking about when I talk about green capitalism? I'm talking about this. Beyond Meat, the Impossible Burger. I love burgers, don't get me wrong. Like, you know, I had loads of like, you know, burger-based foods in the past week alone, last night even, like when I came here. Like, I want all of these foods. I want the Ben & Jerry's ice cream. I want all of the vegan cheeses. They're all great. But if we think that like green capitalism is going to replace grassroots activism, we have to think again. That has never been the case. That has never been the case in any liberation movement. You can't simply buy your way to freedom. You cannot buy your way out of capitalism with more capitalism. It's great to have these burgers, but like so many people are like, oh, we just create the perfect burger. If we finally have the perfect, everybody will eat this burger, and it's look, I got burgers coming out of my ass. Like these are like, there are so many vegan burgers out there. Like when the perfect one is never just going to suddenly materialize. Like it's like if it was going to happen, it would have happened by now. We have amazing vegan burgers now. We have amazing vegan ice creams. Yes, they do make a difference. No, they are not a replacement for grassroots activism. And there is a place for both. And that's something that I think a lot of people who are very polarized on this issue don't really want to internalize. We need both. We absolutely can do with both. And so this isn't an either or proposition. It's a both and we really, really don't get with the both and. It's like, you know, oh, there is this one way and this is my way and that's it. No liberation has ever been achieved strictly by like one means alone. We're not going to leaflet our way to animal liberation either. But the people who are very, very pro-green capitalism, they ignore the value that grassroots activism has so often. I know that there's at least one person here who is familiar with Tobias Lehnert. He's actually a great person. Like, don't get me wrong. I love Tobias, and I love having conversations about him because we fight. But he's wonderful. Tobias, like, you know, his philosophy, he has said on many an occasion that, like, you know, I want people to walk into a grocery store or into a convenience store, and I don't want them to have to think about what they're picking up. I do. I need people to think about what they're picking up, because this isn't just a one-dimensional type of movement, because we need people to have access to critical thinking. This type of thinking that like, oh, people are like, this is dangerous. People are either too stupid or too selfish or too disconnected to actually make a connection, to actually think about these things meaningfully. That's what this type of thinking does. I don't think that. It is absolutely categorically untrue. Green capitalism wants you to think that people are not able to do this, people are not able to engage with their empathy. I don't believe that. That is categorically not true. The existence of all of you fine people in this room prove that it's not true. What we have done over several generations is promote capitalism at the expense of everything else, so we don't look past the individual product that's in front of us. That is the danger of capitalism. We don't see the lineage of that product. Like, we just see the actual product. That is what capitalism has taught us. And so no, we don't achieve, like, you know, we don't buy our way out of this nightmare. That is a one-dimensional approach. We cannot think that. And it's also not demonstrated to be true either. I'm sorry, like, I had meant to tell you about that slide before it happened and I forgot. But like that, the next slide is going to have you already saw it. It's a terrible image, but the headline is what's important. Global meat eating is on the rise, bringing surprising benefits. This is from The Economist. This is in no way a left-leaning, publication at all. As Africans get richer, they will eat more meat and live longer, healthier lives. The next one, this is actually a study. This is a study from 2018. This is very recent. This is just last year. There are multiple studies like this. Meat consumption, health, and the environment. And of course, because you can't read the abstract, I actually have it here. Meat consumption is rising annually as human populations grow and affluence increases. Godfrey et al. Review this trend, which has major negative consequences for land and water use and environmental change. You don't have to read the whole thing, but the gist of it is there. Like, yeah, like meat consumption, actually, it's not decreasing, not yet, but it remains relatively stable and has done for the past decade, and it looks like it's going to remain stable over the next decade. The meat industry is not scared of our like products. You know why? For the same reason that the wheat industry wasn't afraid of gluten-free products. We're just adding to the repertoire of products that are available on the shelves. It doesn't mean that there is going to be a huge shift. Because we have gluten-free pasta did not mean that wheat pasta sales plummeted. That is not what happened, and that's not what's scheduled to happen. When you look at all of the trends across the, across the spectrum of scholarly resources that we have available to us, the existence of plant-based products does not mean that there's going to be a global shift. What's happening is another product of Western imperialism. Like, we may remain constant or negligibly decrease our consumption of meat, but Western imperialism has taught other cultures that eating meat is a sign of wealth. Nigerian people, there is actually an article in Quartz that's talking about the existence of veganism in African countries. It's very difficult for people because they have forgotten their vegan roots. They have forgotten their vegan lineage because over the past couple of decades, people have looked at the consumption of meat and dairy products as a sign of affluence and wealth. This is us exporting our Western values to other countries. Up until the 1800s, Japan largely existed as a culture that was largely vegetarian because their main religions are Shinto and Buddhism, and those are vegetarian religions. And then what happened? The introduction of Western culture and Western ideology. And boom, Japanese people started consuming meat products. And that happened again after the Second World War when the war victors were observed eating hamburgers and bacon. We export our Western values to other parts of the globe. And the meat industry is very cognizant of this. If we're not going to consume these products to excess in the global West, fine. They'll sell their products to other countries, to other BRIC countries, and and other African countries. That is a real thing that we need to be observing and that we need to be mindful of. No, green capitalism alone is not going to save us, and we need to internalize that message. This is the last thing. Radical veganism is the difference between emancipation and liberation. For far too long, we've listened to people use the rallying cry, empty the cages or open the cages. How many people have heard that phrase used? Yeah, opening the cages, that's great. We open the cages and then what? We need to understand that emancipation is not just simply freeing animals from their cage. It also means decolonizing their lands. It also means not gentrifying their neighborhoods. 60% of wild animal species have gone extinct. We're witnessing I'm sure I don't have to tell anybody this in this room because we're all well aware of the lack of biodiversity that we're experiencing right now. We're in the middle of the 6th mass extinction, and this is a real thing that's going on. Yeah, we can't just open the cages. We need to repopulate the planet. We need to observe ways in which we need to financially and emotionally support animals after they have been liberated. We need to work on health care for other species. We need to work on reproductive health for species. Chickens in the 21st century are nothing like chickens the way that they existed even a couple of decades ago. Why? We've stolen their reproductive autonomy. We have stolen, what do we do with these animals after they have been liberated? And that's what I mean when I say that there's a difference between animal liberation and emancipation. We can no longer have conversations about whether or not animals are worthy of moral consideration. They are. Allowing that conversation to progress and allowing that conversation to continue does us a disservice. We're through fucking playing defense with this. We are playing on the offense now. We are no longer allowing the people on the other side to dictate the conversation. We're not going to allow people to say that veganism is racist. We're not going to allow people to say that veganism is classist. We're not going to allow people to say that veganism is ableist. You know what's ableist? You know what's racist? You know what's classist? The fucking meat and dairy industries, the fur industries that are exploiting the resources on this planet and stealing from people on the other side. You want to have a conversation about intersectionality? We need to include black women who don't live in the global West. Black women who are a part of a population who are vulnerable to the effects of climate change before we will ever see the effects of climate change happening in the West. We need to have conversations that are much more meaningful and much different than the conversations that we're having now. We need to have radical conversations. And so this is the last slide. Solidarity is not a matter of altruism. Solidarity comes from the inability to tolerate the affront to our own integrity of passive or active collaboration in the oppression of others. And from the deep recognition that, like it or not, our liberation is bound up with that of every other being on this planet. Once again, like it or not, our liberation is bound up with that of every other being on this planet. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Just really quickly, if you want more information about the things that I've talked about here, my website is www.christophersebastian.info. And if you want to support this work, if you want to support radical vegan activism, please support me on Patreon. It's patreon.com/Christopher Sebastian. Thank you again. I am so sorry I ran.